Hey everybody, it's Tracy, and in the further progression and update concerning unlicensed Forex brokers in the wake of St. Vincent prohibiting unlicensed Forex brokers, yet not actually enacting a licensing structure, which you could argue would have been very profitable for the country, as opposed to just kicking everybody out. So there's a few things to kind of look at because it's getting more and more difficult because obviously with back in January when St. Vincent shut it down, they gave all the brokers that were operating that they could figure out, and they're only really looking at the corporate registry and trying to find names that would indicate that the company was engaged in Forex. And they're sending them like a one page, and I've seen it, it's like a 1-page document that says, are you engaged in Forex? It's stupid, but they are actually like cutting brokers off, and especially some of the larger ones. There's been this obviously like haste to go get a license somewhere, and you see the lower hanging fruit being like Mauritius, Seychelles, Vanuatu, and the feedback that I've received from not only brokers looking to become licensed, but also the regulators themselves, is that the process is slowing down with the prospect of each of those three jurisdictions suspending the acceptance of applications given the nature and the volume that they're receiving, right? And obviously in tax neutral jurisdictions, as I've spoken about before, these licenses are very important. So they have no reason to really restrict them because they're not earning tax dollars off the profits of a Forex broker. They're earning money off the fees, right? The licensing fees, the investment in economic substance, which is silly and I've talked about before. But all these things are tantamount to making them offshore financial centers and making it profitable and worth their while. But at the same time, they don't really have the wherewithal to want to increase their regulatory departments, right? The FSC in Mauritius has the same amount of people now processing 20 times the average volume of applications, right? So now things are taking longer, right? And there's going to be a point that I foresee, and I think other people have foreseen, is that at some point they just won't be able to handle it and will basically say, look, we're not taking any more applications until we process our backlog. And the backlog's getting bigger and bigger and bigger because no one really knew or anticipated how many unlicensed brokers there in fact were, right? There was a ton. And that's fine because you know what? As long as they weren't scams, traders didn't care, right? And there was a lot of very legitimate players in the industry that just weren't licensed because it just didn't behoove them to be so. And I get that, right? But now it's starting to flow through into different areas, right? One that I've talked about before is banking. There was always banking opportunities through St. Vincent for unlicensed Forex, but now those have shut off, right? And now you're starting to see the dominoes fall even further with more up. And you never had to bank in St. Vincent, although there was one bank that would sort of service most of them. You could bank in other places, but now slowly, I've noticed a lot of these banks are saying no, or they're saying if you're an early stage or you don't meet certain like deposit requirements or throughput requirements, we're not going to take you. Now banking is going away slowly, but being less available. Same with payment rails, right? Your EMIs and the providers, the licensed institutions that are providing for card deposits, IBANs with the whole 9 yards, they're going the same way because they're getting pressure because they're regulated, and you know a lot of them are regulated even in like the UK, and they're getting pushback from the FCA, for instance, who's saying you can't handle that because most of the unlicensed Forex brokers, and it's not anything to do with the trading, it always goes back to the AML, right? Like they weren't really following what little AML regulation that St. Vincent had, or at least that was the perception. Most did, but who knows? Now you're losing your payment rails, right? You're losing your ability to onboard clients, which sort of defeats the purpose, right? Then you have the marketing aspect that I call it, which is like the various copy trading platforms like a Zulu Trade, which going back to November of last year had shut off access to any unlicensed broker. And now you're seeing other popular platforms shutting off access to unlicensed brokers, right? So that's a great way that a lot of people like get into brokers in the first place, is because they can just copy trade because they don't know anything about Forex. As 90% of people who are on Forex brokers, who have accounts with Forex brokers, don't. They're not really traders, they're just copy traders, and they're using EAs and all that kind of stuff. And so now that's going away, right? And now there's like talk about MetaTrader maybe cutting off access, and that would be fatal, right? It hasn't happened, but it would be absolutely fatal. You're running into, obviously, the ability to get a license, the ability to work with popular copy trading and other platforms, possibly a software issue. And what do? Well, obviously, you can go get a license. If you don't want to get a license, or you don't think it's justified, which makes sense, there's still places that you can go. Nevis, Cook Islands, right? Marshall Islands. All those places don't have particular FX broker registration or regulation, but they do have, probably with the exception of Nevis, somewhat sophisticated AML KYC, and they're going to look at that, and they're going to look at that and your compliance with that as a means with which to quasi-regulate you, which inherently isn't that hard, and you don't want to be a conduit for money laundering as it is, but that's kind of what you face. Like, those three jurisdictions are still in play from an unlicensed standpoint, but there's pressure being brought upon them, which conceivably would change the landscape over time, right? So you could park there and maybe camp out for a year, but it may not last forever. Nevis has legislation on its books, but they haven't passed what's called an enabling regulation, meaning there's a regulation that's been passed that says this is how we're going to regulate Forex, but it requires a subsequent law being passed to actually enact the previous law. Very odd, but that's how they do things, right? You look at their hedge fund law. They don't regulate hedge funds, but they've had a hedge fund law on the books for 20 years. None of those places, I think, with maybe the exception of the Cook Islands, because they just don't care, ultimately not a long-term solution. So you go back to, well, I need a license, right? You could easily move to any of those three places and just operate, and then work on the license at your own speed, and maybe get in the queue before they cut off registration in any place, really. But it's getting more difficult, mostly from an operational standpoint, banking, software, etc. But I foresee, at least over the next maybe 3 years, that the unlicensed Forex thing is just going to be an untenable model. Eventually, you're going to need the license. It's just when you can do it and when you want to do it. That's my latest update on unlicensed Forex. If you have any questions, definitely hit me up, adamtracy.io, and I will talk to you next time. Cheers.